3 years ago, I taught you how to make techno rumbles. I gave you a flow chart and I taught you to make things like this and like this. But since then, I've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of research, and I have a different vision that I want to share with you today. We're now 3 years later, and I want to get aesthetically a little bit more precise, a little bit more minimalist, and really focus on the thing that excites me the most about techno rumbles. And that is adding grain to a kick. What do I mean by that? For example, here's a kick with no grain. Here's just a grain by itself. And here's now the grainy kick. So the kick without the grain and with the grain. You see, over the years, I find that one of the things that attracts me the most in a lot of different aesthetic art forms is when the grain of the medium comes through. When things aren't perfect. Like, for example, in visual art, if you take a gradient and you add noise to it, it becomes this beautiful texture. This is the equivalent of somehow taking something that's a bit too clean and too punchy and just making it filthy. It's a purely aesthetic choice. If you are not attracted to this aesthetic, just move right along. This video is not for you. I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that it has taken me years to realize that the aesthetic thing that I'm attracted to in a lot of sort of dirty and hypnotic techno is exactly this type of degradation pulled off in a skillful way. So all of this research has culminated in something that to some of you is going to seem like I'm going too far or something like a crazy way of engineering something that just sounds like a bad kick. And I don't know what to tell you. Welcome to my rabbit hole. This is my Mad Hatter's tea party. I've been here the whole time. And I'm now going to try and lead some breadcrumbs to you in case this aesthetic appeals to you. So without further ado, what's the formula? Well, I have another diagram for you. As you saw from my intro, we're going to be working with two distinct concepts. One is the kick and the other is the grain. We're going to be creating these two things separately and then balancing them compared to each other as we mix them back together to create our final sample of a single grainy kick. So first, let's talk about the kick. For me, what the kick needs to be is a single thumpy sine wave or some kind of simple waveform that sweeps down really quick, that goes boo over the course of maybe 50 to 100 milliseconds, something like that. So it sounds percussive and it sounds like a thump. On the spectrum analyzer, it just looks like a little L-shaped line, and that just means that's the thump of the kick. That means when the kick hits, it's going to hit you in the chest or in the belly, right? And you're going to want the fundamental frequency of that just above 40 hertz. I recommend synthesizing it yourself. My preferred method these days is using Punchbox, but any kick synthesizer, for example, Kick 2, will also do just fine. So you want a thumpy little thump that doesn't sustain out for too long, because we're not trying to create a tonal low end. We're going to try and create an atonal low end instead. A tonal low end would sound like ooh in the low end, whereas what we're trying to create is a more like a like white noise. So this kick just has to be short and punchy. It's mostly about the transient. You definitely don't want this ringing out into the next kick. Here are the settings that I'm using on Punchbox in case you want to just copy paste them. But really any kick synthesizer will do, okay? Now the next step is to create the grain, and that's where it gets slightly more complicated, because it's tempting to think it's just a matter of slapping on a reverb and you're pretty much there. In fact, I'm finding that I pretty consistently need 6 steps to create a beautiful grain. Let me go through them one by one. Step number 1 is that your source sound needs to be a click. You don't want it to have a lot of ringing out sub bass that's tonal, because adding reverb to that won't turn it into like the equivalent of brown noise, which is what we're looking for. A wiser approach is to just take a transient click, because adding reverb to a click generates something akin to the echoey kind of brown noise that we're looking for. Here's a little click that I created by simply taking that kick drum that I was working with and just shortening the envelopes a little bit. So step 2 is that we're going to add a reverb to that click. And the type of reverb that you add does matter. It really, really does. It matters an awful lot. So right now, what I would recommend is maybe find yourself a convolution reverb, set it to 100% wet, make sure it's mono, either in the plugin or by monoing it after the plugin, and start flicking through presets until one of them gives you the character that you want. When the rest of the processing is in place, you may want to come back here and flick through a few more reverb presets. But for now, find one that you're comfortable with. Make sure it's mono and make sure it has plenty of low grainy frequencies. Because the next step, step number 3, is that we're going to low pass it. Because we're going to really want to focus in on those very low mids. We're basically creating a layer that has lows and mids. So we have to make sure that the character of the ultra lows is rough and grainy, and that the character of the mids is sort of dark and ominous as well. Again, with the filter cutoff, you may want to come back and mess with the cutoff later on. But let's just put that into place. Now, the next thing is that your reverb might be tending to go quiet. It might go from loud to quiet every hit. And in fact, we want something that stays pretty loud throughout. So what we're going to do is maybe compress it if it needs it. As step number 4, we're going to check if it needs some compression. And if it does, we're going to compress it quite a lot, either with downward compression or with upward compression, until its volume is more or less pinned and that the distortion that compression is adding isn't too unpleasant. After all, this whole thing is supposed to be quite distorted, so we're not afraid of a bit of distortion, but just check that the character of that distortion is still something that you're attracted to. And speaking of distortion, if this isn't sounding grainy enough yet, step number 5 is to add saturation to it. That can be with any saturation plugin. It can be as simple as simply using your stock plugin, for example, in Ableton, using the saturator and setting it to soft sine mode, adding just a few decibels of drive. You don't have to go too far with this. Just listen and see, does it have the character that you want? Don't be afraid of adding some saturation. And it's a bit of a weird feeling to low pass something and then saturate it, because you're removing all of these harmonics and then asking the software to generate you new harmonics. This might seem counterintuitive, but it does work. It makes it a warmer, fuller, dark sound, and that darkness is aesthetically what we're going for. Now, all of these steps risk making a mess. Here's an example of completely uncontrolled reverb. They risk just making a wall of sound, and what we want is something that feels like it's part of the kick drum. So that means that it's a sound that starts when the kick starts, and it ends at a certain point before the next kick starts. It doesn't just all run into each other and become just a drone, a wall of sound. No, it's something that we perceive as to be part of the kick. And so how do we control the envelope like that? Well, gating might be the best way to do it. And if we add the gate, this is what we get. Something with contour. Something that feels like it could be part of the kick drum layer. So congratulations, you've got yourself a kick and you've got yourself a grain. Super nice. Now all you have to do is combine them. And that sounds easier than it is sometimes. And this is often the point at which I get super frustrated and lose all sense of perspective and balance.
My God! I'm losing my perspicacity!
Because it's actually not easy, first of all, to judge the mix down balance of your kick, and also not easy to judge the mix down balance of something as rowdy as a grain like that. And then together there's so many opportunities for you to lose balance and to create something that's super muddy or has no more punch or that has way too much subs. There's a million different problems that could occur. So I want to concentrate your mental energy into 3 questions, 3 mixing questions. Okay, let's divide our frequencies into lows and mids, and highs we won't even talk about in this case. And let's say that the lows and mids, they cross over at about 200 hertz. I'm just making up a number here, really. So we're talking about everything that below 200 hertz is lows and everything above 200 hertz is mids, okay? Just for the sake of these questions. Now, the 3 questions are, question number 1, are the low frequencies of your kick and the low frequencies of your grain in balance in comparison to each other? So to check this, all you got to do is you got to go onto the master channel and find a way just to solo that frequency band. For example, with an EQ3, just solo only the lows. For example, here's what that sounds like on the kick that I'm working on right now. I'm trying to picture, does this still have some of the thump of the kick in there? But does the kick and the grain feel like it's one unit, like it's one musical voice? If I would hear this coming out of a big club sound system, would it sound super bloated and farty? Or does it sound like it's actually got some heft and some chunk and that grit that I'm looking for? Up to you to figure out the answer. But if you need to adjust the low frequencies of either one of these elements, just go into that one element and make the EQ adjustments on that one element. So for example, if the lows of your grain are overpowering your kick, just go into your grain and put like a low shelf on there until it no longer overpowers your kick, until they have some proportionality. And now we can do the same question the second question, for the mids. Are the mids of your grain proportional to the mids of your kick? This is what it sounds like for me. That sure as heck sounds like a grainy kick to me. And the kick doesn't have too much punch in the mid, because that's often a problem that I have, is that my kick has too much transient or punch in the mid, and I need to pull down the frequencies or remove the transient punch in the mids because the kick is just too punchy in the mids. And sometimes on the grain, I'll need to high shelf it and just really bring out those mid frequencies, because the goal of getting the mids balanced is that this kick will still sound massive and dirty and grainy even on small speakers. Because on small speakers, we're mostly just listening to the mids of our track. And so we need to make sure that all the elements have the right character in the mids. And so it's no use to us if the grain only exists in the ultra low end, if we can't hear that, if that immediately gets lost the moment there's no big subwoofer. So we got to make sure that the mids of our grain are up there together with the mids of our kick, so they feel like one sound. It feels like one big kick that's being distorted. When you blend these two layers together, you're going to create a new sound, right? And that sound might have too much bass or too much mids, or all sorts of problems that need addressing. And so you can do that on the master channel. After you've made sure that the proportions are right of the blend, you can now treat the resulting sound. And so then the third mixdown question, after you've solved those first two questions, is, are there any mix balancing things that you need to do to the resultant sounds, the sound that is composed of both parts? Do you, for example, need to cut the bass overall? Even if the proportions of the two sounds in the bass are correct, you still might end up with a kick that has way too much low end. So these are the kind of mix moves that you can then do on the resultant sound, which is also a great moment to, for example, put it through a little bit of saturation or some other kind of processing just to blend the two layers together even further. You might put it through some equalization, maybe some compression, maybe a touch of limiting, but not too much. And then by this point, usually my ears are pretty fried because I can no longer tell what sounds big or what sounds small or what sounds good or bad. So sometimes what I'll need is I'll need to add in some extra elements just to refresh my ears and to remind my ears that the mids and highs are going to be dominated by mostly different musical elements. So I hope you noticed that with these concepts, you can do this in any software with any tools. As long as you somewhat understand the principles, you can apply this with whatever tools you've got. During the research process, I ended up going in a lot of different directions, and I bounced a lot of that to audio, and I put it all into a little sample pack that I'm just going to give to you for free. The link is in the description below. It's got a whole bunch of grainy kicks so that I don't have to go through this process every time I just need a kick. I have to say it's quite satisfying to have brought this aesthetic madness to such a specific point and then to have been able to solve it in a way that's very satisfying. So I know you're going to call me crazy, but if you're still watching this video, you might be almost as crazy as I am. So tell me what you've done with this process. Leave a comment below to show me some love. Say something nice to me. Like the video, subscribe, share this video with all your techno friends. And until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye-bye.